Hello friends, welcome to A Gentle Healing Journey. My name is Rain Francis, and on my channel I talk about how to deal with life's struggles and challenges. This video is part of my series about why we stay in emotionally abusive relationships, but as I always say, this could apply to any type of abusive situation. So today I'm going to talk about the 8th reason why we stay: dismissive behavior. Now, when we think of dismissive behavior, we might often think of another person dismissing us, ignoring us, not putting any importance into what we're saying or doing, or even giving us the cold shoulder. We often think of people who try to gaslight us, who try to convince us that something that is actually happening isn't happening. But the fact is, dismissive behavior is also something that we can take on towards ourselves. This is an interesting subject because dismissive behavior can start with the abusive partner displaying it. And the more that time goes by, as the abusive partner dismisses the victim's feelings, the victim starts to take on that behavior of dismissing their own feelings. So throughout this discussion, I'm going to be talking about both the abuser and the victim displaying dismissive behavior. And I really want to get into the meat of it because dismissive behavior towards the self can stem from being in an environment where your feelings were dismissed, and it can start way back in childhood. So we're going to get into that too. So the question is, how do people develop dismissive behavior? When it comes to a victim who is dismissing the behavior of their abuser, it could develop during the abusive relationship, but a lot of the time it develops in childhood. Some people learned in childhood that emotional expression maybe gets punished or ignored. A child whose sadness gets met with, "Oh, you're fine," or with an angry, "Just go to your room," or whose fear gets brushed off as silly, doesn't just feel misunderstood and unheard in the moment. They start to develop that belief that their emotional responses are wrong. This matters because children build their entire emotional vocabulary from their caregivers' behaviors and responses. And then, there are some people who learn to use dismissiveness as a defense mechanism, a way to avoid feeling uncomfortable when emotions get involved, because they saw maybe one parent or another do the exact same thing. Maybe they witnessed on a regular basis that one parent gives the other parent the silent treatment right after a heated discussion. Maybe they notice that one parent or the other uses the boring old phrase, "whatever," when the other parent is trying to have a discussion. The child then learns that being dismissive helps them avoid an uncomfortable conversation or argument. But of course, this is misguided learning, because the child doesn't understand that this type of behavior is destructive and it results in issues and problems continuing and never being solved, which of course is relationship poison. Unfortunately, when we grow up in environments where there is dismissive behavior, a lot of the times we carry that behavior into adulthood. Sometimes we're not even aware of it. It just becomes kind of part of our behavior. And from a psychology standpoint, I understand this. I don't judge people for this. But what's upsetting is when a loved one approaches a dismissive partner and tells them that their behavior is harmful, yet instead of being self-aware enough to think about it, the abusive partner dismisses the conversation about dismissiveness, That's when it becomes very harmful, and it really dooms the relationship, in my opinion. We all have patterns of behavior that we learned in childhood, and as I mentioned, a lot of the times we're not aware of it. But if we start to notice that other people are mentioning things to us, that what we're doing causes them harm, wouldn't we want to explore that a little bit more deeply so that we can stop hurting other people? Unfortunately, children who grow up to be abusive and controlling adults, they don't want to explore their emotions more deeply. They want to dismiss them, and in turn, dismiss the person who brings the subject up. I knew a guy one time, he could never keep a relationship going. He had about a dozen girlfriends in about so many years, and Though he truly wanted to have a long-term relationship and get married, none of these relationships ever worked out for him. And he used to always blame the girls. They were too needy, they were too critical, or they had issues. 12 girls in 12 years, and he couldn't even stop to think that maybe it could have been his behavior. He was crude and antagonistic and difficult, but he couldn't see that perhaps these qualities about himself could have possibly doomed all of these relationships. If we just think of the numbers, the common denominator was him. I didn't know him that well, but I worked with him for a little while, and so I didn't have the time to really learn much about his childhood, but I knew a little bit about his behavior from working with him. And this is what I mean. Sometimes we're not aware of it. But if we're willing to take a deep dive and consider that we might be the problem, if we don't do that, the behavior will continue and the relationships will always fail. So why don't we talk about dismissive behavior by an abusive partner? Dismissive behavior can show up as minimizing, deflecting, or disengaging. When you minimize your partner's feelings, you're basically telling your partner that their feelings are wrong. If your partner develops the courage to face you and explain to you that it hurts their feelings when you, say, swear at them, if you don't want to deal with your partner's feelings, or if you don't want to change your behavior, you're going to minimize it. You might say something like, "Oh, stop being so sensitive. It's just the way I talk." I can relate to this. In fact, I can relate to every subject pretty much in this series. But this one I can relate to the most. It really messed me up. My late husband was very abrasive and reactive and angry a lot of the times. It was all based on his own insecurities and his own issues, but he took them out on me. He had a habit of telling me to go F myself whenever I would try to talk to him about his abusive behavior and how much it hurt me and how it was pushing me away from him. He would say the typical, "Oh, you're overreacting and you're too sensitive. This is just how I talk. My entire family swears. We all get angry, but we still love each other." But to me, this was just basically telling me that my feelings didn't matter. So I would push the issue a little bit, of course, with caution, because I knew how he would react most of the times. But I guess I just kept trying to bring it up in hopes that one day he would take me seriously. So I would continue the conversation by saying, "Well, it's your choice. I'm telling you that you're doing something that hurts my feelings. Why wouldn't you want to stop doing that thing?" And most of the time, his reaction would be, again, "Go F yourself, Rain." And then he would walk away from me and give me the silent treatment. I was often told that my feelings were wrong. This is minimizing. Now, if we think of deflecting, we can think of blame shifting, projecting, changing the subject, or gaslighting. Think of the same situation as I mentioned previously. I approach my late husband and tell him that I hate when he swears at me because it makes me cry. If he were to deflect this by blame shifting, he would switch it around and turn himself into the victim. He would say something like, "Well, when you spend too much time on your studies and on your work, it makes me feel like you don't love me. It makes me feel lonely. I feel like you don't want to be with me anymore. I'm so sad about this." So you see, I approach him with something that he's done to hurt me, and he turns it around and makes himself the hurt party. And not just one thing, it's a huge drama. I don't love him anymore. So this shifts the blame onto me in order for him not to have to deal with what I've brought up in the conversation that hurt me. Now, if he were to project, then he would say something like, "Well, you talk down to me all the time. You swear at me all the time. It hurts my feelings, but I don't overreact and I don't get sensitive." This is kind of a combination of projection and gaslighting, because he's projecting onto me what he does to me. And at the same time, he's trying to convince me that I do these things when I actually don't. And finally, deflection by changing the subject. Let's use the same example. I approach him to tell him that when he swears at me, it hurts me and it makes me cry. Well, he might suddenly say something like, oh my gosh, I forgot to tell you, there's a huge leak under the kitchen sink and it's getting worse. Complete deflection by changing the subject. Now, we talked about minimizing and deflecting. How about disengaging? Disengaging can actually be a very good tool in an abuse victim's toolbox. To disengage basically means to separate yourself from the abuse. So if you disengage as your partner is running you down, you're trying not to pay attention or allowing their words and their behavior to make you feel bad. This is also called gray rocking, and I tried it, but I wasn't able to succeed at it very well. But if we disengage as a way to abuse our partner, we're basically not taking our partner seriously. We're not really listening. We act bored. I remember witnessing disengagement in my late husband on many occasions, and this usually happened when I was excited about something that I was successful at, whether it was one of my YouTube channels, whether it was completing a course in my studies or improving my credit score. I would be very excited about it. And of course, because he was my husband, he was the first person that I wanted to share this with. But I could see his eyes glazing over as I was talking to him sometimes. He looked so bored. And instead of engaging in the conversation, he might say something like, oh yeah, that's great. And then he would start talking about something that involved him. I felt very shut down, and it was obvious that the message was, well, Rain, what you're saying to me isn't that important. So I just wanted to give some examples of how abusive people can use dismissive behavior as a way to cut their partner down, as a way to make it clear that to their partner that what they're doing or what they're saying is really not that important to them. This causes a gradual loss of confidence, which I'm going to talk about in the next video. When we are constantly cut down and dismissed by the person we love, it messes with our self-worth. It makes us question as to whether our feelings are valid, as to whether our accomplishments are all that important or not. It just makes us feel bad. And over time, you may not decide to share anymore. What's the point? They don't care anyway, right? I know I stopped sharing, and it didn't seem to make a difference at all. He never questioned why I stopped sharing. I think he kind of preferred it that way. Over time, being on the receiving end of dismissive behavior, it teaches you something about, something very self-damaging, that your feelings and your thoughts don't register with the people closest to you. Not that your feelings and thoughts are wrong, not that they're annoying, that they're just invisible. As you can probably conclude from what I've already talked about, dismissive behavior can be learned through childhood observations, but it can also be developed when you are in an abusive relationship. And I can speak from experience when I say that as the abuse in my former marriage escalated and got more intense, the blinders that I was wearing started to get bigger. I started to do all of the things that my dismissive partner did to me, to myself. And by that, I mean I started to gaslight myself. I started to reinterpret the abusive episodes. I started to make excuses for being dismissed. I started to explain things away, downplay the abuse, rationalize his moods and his anger. Like I said, I was wearing blinders. And I'm still in the process of trying to figure out why I did that for so many years. It's a mix of things, and this is all part of my healing process. But some of the things that I used to say to myself were, it wasn't all that bad. Oh, he was just stressed. It takes two to tango. He didn't mean it. He'll apologize tomorrow. And the worst one that I told myself, I'm no angel. It was probably my fault. In my case, it was a protective mechanism. One of my parents was very dismissive to the other, and I witnessed this as a child. I don't think I ever brought this behavior into my adulthood, though. I remember one of my parents was very quick to give what they called the cold shoulder. This parent was often silent, and you could feel the tension. So instead of bringing this into my adulthood, I did the opposite. I was completely unattracted to anyone who called themselves the strong and silent type. If I was with anyone, a potential partner or even a potential friend, man or woman, who couldn't engage in mature conversation, I walked away. I even had a sibling who did that. She took on the traits of the strong and silent type parent I had. And I remember we were on this little vacation on Prince Edward Island, and we went to the beach. We stayed at a nice little bed and breakfast, and pretty much the whole time I felt like I was having this one-way conversation. It was so uncomfortable and painful. I felt unheard and invisible. I ended up spending time with that sibling because I just didn't want to be around someone like that. I didn't like how they made me feel, so I walked away. But in my relationship, my late husband wasn't like that for the first few years. He developed that kind of dismissive behavior over the years, and by then I was hooked. I was invested. There were other reasons why I stayed, but I didn't want to give up the relationship because I still had hope. And by using dismissive behavior on myself, by dismissing his abusive behavior, it's how I maintained some kind of stability in a very unstable environment. It's a survival mechanism to the day-to-day reality that things aren't as good as I'm pretending that they are. Another way that I was dismissing his behavior was that I forgave way too quickly. As soon as he put on the charm, as soon as he apologized and made promises of change, I wanted so badly to believe him and to restore the peace at home that I forgave very quickly. But I basically taught him that he could pretty much get away with anything with me. I would always forgive him. Okay, now, I was debating whether or not I should tell the following story. This is a very difficult incident for me to talk about, but as I say in all of my videos, my goal is to spread awareness, and my goal is to also share my story in hopes that anyone going through the same thing will learn something from it. I don't necessarily feel comfortable telling this story, but it shows us, because it shows a side of my late husband, that is despicable. So here I go. I've always had dogs, as you know. I have 5 dogs now, and my late husband and I had adopted 3 dogs in 2015. All 3 of them passed away over the years. The last dog who died was my beloved hound dog, Jack, my little soulmate. He was 18 and he died in 24. 2 years prior, both my husky Charlie and my shepherd mix Marlene passed away, and that's when I adopted my Rottweiler Raven. Now, she's been with me since 2022. So after Jack died, he was the last of the 3 dogs that my late husband and I had adopted together. At that point, my late husband and I were barely talking. We had separate bedrooms. He was up all night. I was up all day. There was hardly any interaction between us, and also between him and Raven. I wanted to adopt some more dogs. So a few months after my little Jack passed away, I got a call from the shelter where I had adopted Raven in 2022. They asked me, "Are you interested in adopting a puppy?" I considered it because Raven, she seemed to be depressed. She lacked energy. She wasn't excited to eat. She kept looking out the window. I think she was missing Jack. I wanted more dogs, and she needed a companion. And I figured, well, a puppy would be crazy energy to put back into my life. So Raven and I did the 4-hour drive to the shelter, and I met little Benny Bear. He was 4 months old, filled with energy, very friendly, and he and Raven got along. So I told the ladies at the shelter that I would love to adopt him and bring him home. And that's when they got me. They hooked me. They told me the story of Benny Bear's mother, Lucy, who was also in the shelter, and Lucy's mama, Miley, who was in the shelter as well. They'd been all taken away from a puppy mill. The girls had been kept in cages and were badly neglected, very thin. They were basically breeders. And little Benny Bear was scheduled to be a trained attack dog. Of course, my heart went out to them. I wanted to meet the girls. And as you can conclude, if you know my channel, I came home with all 3 of them. Ali Faye, my pointer, was at the shelter at the same time, but she wasn't ready for adoption because she had to have her tail amputated. But 3 months later, I ended up adopting her as well. There were a few minor fights over the months, mainly between Lucy and everyone else. Lucy was in the worst shape, and she was probably fighting both out of fear, but also to gain some kind of dominance in the pack. I had been told that she was a bait dog, and I'm not going to go into that here. It's too upsetting. If you want to look that up, just please beware. It's very disturbing. So I realized that part of Lucy's aggression towards the other dogs had to do with the idea of attacking them before they could attack her. It's very sad, but it's extremely dangerous. I didn't realize how dangerous it could be. I have some other thoughts about this as well, and I'll discuss those in a little bit. I talked to a friend about that, and anyway, I'll talk about that after. But one day during the summer of 2024, I was sitting by the window with Miley. She's a pit bull boxer mix. And at that time, my late husband and I were separated but living together. He had promised to move out, but eventually he threatened suicide instead. And anyway, I ended up getting back together with him a few weeks later. But at this point, he had been giving me the silent treatment. He was in his room. I was in my room with the dogs. Lucy walked right up to me and Miley. Her hackles were up, and she was growling. And before I knew what was going on, it was so quick. She started to attack Miley. And Miley is a very strong dog, and she fought hard. And again, before I knew it, I was knocked to the ground. I had 5 dogs fighting and growling and biting each other all on top of me. I was getting scratched from my shoulders all the way to my hips. And as I mentioned, it was the summer, so I was wearing a thin summer dress. And they scratched my arms and my back right through my dress. I couldn't get up because they had me pinned down. It was the pack mentality, 2 dogs start fighting and the rest join in. Well, not Benny Bear so much. He thought it was some kind of game, and he wasn't biting or growling. He was just kind of jumping up and down. I was screaming for help, screaming. No help came. My late husband was in the room right next to me. I was able to roll myself away, and I started crawling towards the hallway. I was crying, like heaving crying, bleeding, and still screaming because I was in fear. And I was trying to order the dogs to stop. It was at that point that my late husband came out of the room. He looked at me on the floor. I was bleeding and crying. He rolled his eyes, and he walked over to the kitchen and very casually picked up the air horn, and he blew the air horn and yelled at them to stop, and they did. Then he looked at me with so much disgust in his eyes, and he said, "You better look for injuries this time." And he walked away into his room and closed the door. I was in shock. When I told this story to one of my dear friends, she was in shock. She said, if my husband and I were fighting and something like that happened, no matter how mad he was at me, he would save me. And I'm so glad that she said this to me, because despite the fact that it's common sense, I had already put the blinders back on. I remember saying to myself, oh, he must have had his headphones on and he was listening to music, and that's why he didn't hear me. It was almost like I was so desperate to dismiss his dismissive behavior that I was delusional. Headphones or not, he heard everything. If he truly didn't hear because he had music on so loud in his headphones, he would never have come out at all. Or maybe when there was a pause in the music and he heard me screaming, if that was the case, and if he cared, he wouldn't have dismissed me the way he did. And after the fact, he probably would have shown compassion, empathy, and care towards me. But that wasn't the case. He heard. This incident of abuse, dismissive behavior, and a complete disregard for my safety and my well-being, and I was trying to make excuses for his behavior. After having that conversation with my friend, I really had to face what I'd been doing and pull those blinders off, one quick pull. My late husband never came to see how I was doing after, never came to help me check on the dogs, just pretended it didn't happen. We rarely spoke, but there was a time when I was coming out of the shower and I was just wearing a towel. He had come out of his room and he was in the hallway. And I guess he noticed all of the scratches on my back and my arms and my shoulders. And he said, "Did that happen during the dog fight?" I turned around and I looked at him and I said, "Of course you know that it did." And at that point he said, well, I figured you were just overreacting. All I could do was shake my head and walk away. It was at that point that I finally realized, and this was hard for me, that he didn't care at all about my well-being. His anger, his silent treatment, his cause, his abusive behavior was more important to him than my life. Because to be honest, there was a point during that dogfight that I was afraid I was going to get killed. 2 of the dogs needed surgery for their injuries. My cuts and bruises healed, but my heart never did. I wanted to give you a shocking example of his dismissive, abusive behavior and my dismissive excuses for that behavior. In my case, rationalizations and excuses were the result of how he treated me, and a mix of hope that the relationship would get better and that he would change. I even refused to listen to the therapists. That's another example of my dismissive attitude, even though they often told me that the abuse would escalate, that eventually there would be a dangerous situation. Of course, they were talking about physical abuse, and that's kind of what I assumed as well. But deep down in my heart, I never thought that he would ever hurt me physically in a dangerous situation. Now, having said that, I never thought that my life would be in danger ever in this type of situation, and that he would allow my life to remain in danger in order to continue to give me the silent treatment. And I'll be honest with you, I think that the only reason he came out of his room was because he realized that the windows were all open, and he was afraid that the neighbors would hear me screaming. I'm convinced of that. And just on a side note, every 4 to 6 months, there would be another dog fight while he was alive. And this continued until last year. After my husband passed away, and after some time passed, when I started to feel much more at peace, the dog fights stopped. It's weird, you know, I've had dogs my whole life, and I have never witnessed a dog fight. I've seen some dogs growl at each other, but nothing like what I experienced with these 5 dogs that day. I know that they've all been traumatized, especially Lucy, who's the one who starts all the fights, but she doesn't do that anymore. And I have a theory about this. When my husband was alive, he was grumpy and angry and loud. He came off as the alpha. I was submissive and quiet, walking on eggshells and trying to avoid drama and conflict at all costs, so I came off as a beta. Dogs are smart. They noticed this. And during that big fight that summer, even though I was screaming at them to stop, they paid no attention to me because they probably saw me as a beta. When he came out of his room and blew that air horn, they all stopped. That's hard for me to admit. And I knew it wasn't simply because of the air horn, because I personally had tried to use the air horn in previous situations where Lucy picked a fight with Ali Faye. The air horn didn't work in that situation, so I ended up filling a bowl of water and pouring it over Lucy to get her to stop, and it worked. And I chalked it up to the fact that, well, it must be the air horn that doesn't work. But it wasn't the air horn. They didn't stop because I was holding the air horn. Lucy stopped because she was shocked by getting soaked with water. But learning a little bit more about human behavior, it had me thinking about canine behavior as well. The 4 dogs that I adopted in 2024 were only with me for 1 year while my husband was alive. But during that year, the atmosphere in the house was always tense. Dogs can sense that tension, and it probably made them feel very anxious and uneasy. And I'm sure it contributed to the dog fights because after my late husband was out of the picture, they started to look up to me as the alpha. And the dog fights stopped. Of course, during the last 1.5 years, I also worked very hard at intensively training them and creating a very peaceful, Zen-like atmosphere in the home. I separated them most of the time so that they couldn't get into any trouble. As you know, when I was out of the house, 3 of them were kept in cages, and they still are, even though they've calmed down and they see me as their leader now. Sometimes I worry that if I leave them alone, I might come home to a disaster. But so far it's been very good, and there's not been a dog fight in a long time. The only time I have to separate them is when I'm not in the house or at night. Lucy sleeps in a crate because I can't keep an eye on her when I'm sleeping, right? Though my instinct tells me that she's probably going to be fine, I still don't want to take that chance. So I just wanted to put you guys at ease because, you know, my dogs all get along very well now. And sometimes all I have to do is give them the eye and they get the idea. Because now I'm the alpha. Now there is harmony at home. That's a little off topic, but I felt the need to mention that. You know, a single dismissive comment during a bad day is human, but consistent patterns where someone's feelings are routinely ignored or labeled as irrational, it's more than just disrespectful behavior. And when it comes to dismissing a person's abusive behavior, victims will also often fool themselves, as I mentioned, putting on the blinders. It's a way to safeguard themselves from the pain of the reality of what they're going through. They dismiss their abuser's behavior so that they don't have to face self-doubt or emotional insecurity or the idea of ending the relationship. This idea may be too draining or overwhelming, so the excuse making and the rationalization continues. But this isn't a solution because it leads to more anxiety, depression, chronic stress, and shame. And unfortunately, sometimes, like in my case, it takes a very dangerous or destructive incident to realize that the blinders have to come off. Whew. So my friends, that is the 8th reason why we stay in abusive relationships. Dismissive behavior. Relationships need emotional involvement, empathy, and understanding. And when dismissive behaviors become a pattern by the victim, it's the equivalent of denial. And until that denial can be blown wide open, the pattern will continue and very likely cause a lot of trauma to the person who is on the other end of that abuse. In my next video in this series that will be coming out next week, I'll discuss a gradual loss of confidence as a reason why we stay in intimate partner relationships that are abusive. Until then, my friends, thank you so much for watching. Please be well, and I'll see you next time. Bye.